Good morning, Rob Northrop here. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. And I want to thank the Florida Urban Forest Council for inviting me to speak with you and to be with you, at least for a little while on a virtual basis. So, well, hey, they wanted me to talk to you a little bit about a book that I just published with a couple of colleagues of mine. Dr. Michael Andrew up in the School of Forestry at UF, and Dr. Wayne Zippra, who's a research forester with the U.S. Forest Service. And the book itself is about planning, urban forest planning. So you and I have come from, I believe, principally the same place in that we've learned a good deal about the science of biology and some ecology, and a good bit about the techniques about how to manage trees and woodlands and forests. And most of us stick to that itself, right? I mean, we do the physical management, we prune, we plant, sometimes we take down and replace trees and even other forms of woody vegetation. But not too many of us really get into major planning efforts. And I think it's a problem. And while what we do for the most part is critically important to maintain in the urban forest, and to ensuring that its risk is mitigated to the point that it can be, and that we get the most efficient value out of the urban forest. And I don't mean that just in terms of economically, although of course that's important, but all of the ecological benefits, the clean air, the clean water, not to mention, as we all know in Florida, just the shade alone, how important that is. And I guess I shouldn't understate that, because in Florida it does get very, very hot, and for many of us, that intensity of the sun and the heat drives up energy bills. For people who are on lower incomes, that's a terrible problem. And of course, for older people and some people with different forms of physical disabilities, the heat itself can be a dangerous thing. So, but these are the things that we mostly spend our time on. The other thing, though, that many of us spend our time on seems to be the roadblocks to good urban forestry. Now, when I say urban forestry, I'm talking about, of course, the human-dominated ecosystem, if you will, of a city and its surroundings in the metropolitan areas. So that's an urban forest, lots of trees, lots of woody shrubs in many parts of the world, not all. I knew a woman who worked out in Utah, in Salt Lake City, and of course, she was the urban forester, but out there, it didn't used to be a forest. But here, in most of where we are in Florida, forests and forests mixed with grasslands have been the predominant vegetation for thousands of years. So that's what we inherit, right? We inherit that. So how do we manage then this urban forest in the long term when we keep running into these barriers? And the barriers I'm going to talk about a little bit, and then I'm going to talk about how to get past those barriers, and maybe for some of us, taking a new path in urban forestry, municipal arboriculture, and finding a different specialization, if you will, for our particular form of expertise. Throughout the presentation, which I hope won't be too long, I'll try to keep it as short as I can, you'll see this address here. And this is the address to the School of Forestry's website, where you can download the book that I and my colleagues had just published. So we put it online, we made it free. It wasn't something we wanted to make money off of. We're just trying to be helpful in terms of helping people perhaps do a better job of conserving the urban forest and getting past some of the barriers that you and I deal with. So getting back to those ideas of some of the barriers, okay, some of the barriers that we deal with when we're working at urban forestry, and it's not just urban forestry in the sense of a municipality. It could be in terms of a community, a county, or perhaps even a region or a state. Some of that has to do with the fact that there's a history to trees in cities and urban areas. And if you and I, as we work through problems dealing with other agencies, with other perspectives, if we're not aware of that history, we can sometimes make assumptions that lead us into blind alleys, really. So I wanted to show you a few things that I had picked up while being here in Florida, working for the university. One of them is this really great book called City Trees. It's a history of trees in the city from the Renaissance to the present. It's incredible, really. I mean, all of you would just enjoy it just for what it is. But it also teaches us that trees were not always in cities. As a matter of fact, up until the Renaissance, trees were pretty much kept out of cities. Trees were considered part of the area outside cities, the wilderness. And in fact, over in Europe, in the old medieval writings, when they would say forest, what forest actually meant was not the forest like we think about it today, but it meant the other. It meant the other place, the wild place. So it wasn't until the Renaissance that we even saw trees coming into cities, and then they were usually just a tree like in a backyard someplace, and they had a religious symbology like the tree of life, okay, like the Garden of Eden. And it really wasn't until the 19th century that we really began to see trees used in cities, mostly by municipalities to line boulevards, you know, as a landscape element in an otherwise linear form of a city. Another book I wanted to show you, and I'll use this phrase over and over again, is The Sanitary City. This is a little bit about the history of engineering of our urban areas. Now, right? Now we're talking about problems that we have with getting trees and shrubs to find space for them and to sustain them over time within our modern cities. Back in the 19th century, the late 19th century, we had serious epidemics popped up, and most of the time when you read about it in London and New York, which were two of the biggest cities at that time. And they had to do with epidemic diseases that were associated with water quality, what we drank and washed our clothes with, and also with sanitation. So what happens is the engineering disciplines do a masterful job of correcting that in the city. And they design these systems so that today we very rarely as people ever think about clean water and sanitation, right? Whether it's the physical sanitation where the garbage trucks come and we have different forms of areas or methodologies for getting rid of the physical, or for simply being able to flush our toilet, right? Engineers did an incredible job. And when they went to school, and they still go to school, you know, they are taught that these things that they do are critically important to the health and the well-being of the people of cities. Super important, right? So what we now have today then is we have cities that have been developed with an engineering perspective, not one that has included the living types of resources that you and I often spend most of our time dealing with. And it's hard for us to imagine why it is that we can't get more trees and shrubs in there, and why, when we talk to people who have a control over the configuration of the city, why we don't get much traction. Partly it's because the dominant culture in the areas of the bureaucracy, public works, planning, transportation, are dominated by engineers, well-meaning people who are part of a legacy that has done a masterful job of making our cities cleaner and healthier. So it's a little bit difficult to get through that, but I think it's important for us to realize that it comes from a tradition and a sense of responsibility, not just a group of people who are putting up barriers in front of us. Okay, so the sanitary city, you'll hear me mention that again. It's also important to know that the professions of the engineers, designers, and aligned landscape architecture are now recognizing that the physical sanitary city is not enough to maintain the health and well-being of the people in the city, that people need more than that. Again, two wonderful books I'm showing you here, Low Impact Development, mostly about hydrology and the value of bringing vegetation back into the city. And then this one, Landscape Architecture Theory, an Ecological Approach. This comes out of the University of Philadelphia, where they're talking about, just as they are in engineering classes now, about the integration of green infrastructure and gray infrastructure. So we're not alone in beginning to get closer to merging these things within the city core itself. The other thing that we need to all recognize, including the different forms of agencies within governments and nonprofits, for that matter, is that conservation, that includes urban forestry, is primarily a social endeavor. It is people's values that determine what gets cared for, what doesn't, what gets restored, and what gets removed. It's people's values. Now, this is where we, as a profession, and society in general, if you will, if you work for an agency or whatever, can begin to look at a way to get past having confrontational conversations with different professions and agencies, and working together. So people's values in a democracy determine who gets elected, not facts and figures, okay? Not who you know. It is the values of people, so that the political side of any municipality, the mayor or the executive and the city council, are all elected based upon people's values. If the people value trees, and we have shown that through numerous state surveys and municipal surveys that my colleagues and I have done, then that's a powerful force for beginning to actually look at the urban forest as a system itself that needs to be and can be integrated with engineering to form a hybrid type of environment in the city core. So it's a social endeavor. Make no mistake about it. People are in contact with the engineered environment parts of the city and the living parts all the time. And what we have found is that overwhelmingly, yes, people want the urban forest. They want it. Now, their lives are full just like ours. They have many things to do, take care of their children, go to work, worry about paying the bills. That's where you and I come in, because we are the few people, and there's not many of us, who work as arborists, municipal arborists, urban foresters, who can bring the understanding of how to bring this about. And we have to become, some of us at least, more involved in making this come to fruition, and not that that's not important, but not just focusing on individual trees or working with individual homeowners or landowners for that matter. So the social system itself, all those values of all those people, are actually the big cog in the wheel, in the machine, if you want, right? They're determining what the government is, because let's face it, it's the mayor and the city council who appoint all the directors of all the departments. If the mayor says, or the city council says, do something, the directors of the departments do it. If they say cooperate and create a plan for the integration of forest and urban into urban engineered systems, then it happens. Not magically, it's hard work, right? But it can happen. Also, we know today that we are in the age of the Anthropocene, and that is that human populations now even dominate ecological systems. So the social system is actually the bigger player when you look at the integration of governance, ecological systems, and then the social values that drive the condition of both of those. But many of us, you and I, and many people in the political process and in the running of agencies and other professions, don't often think about how to tap into, focus on, work with that big driving part of the urban ecology, the urban ecosystem, the social part. You know, here are some books that I've read, and these are not like touchy-feely things. You know, I'm not suggesting that at all. Actually, these 4 books happen to be really great, all written by really super professional folks. Some of them scientists, some of them negotiators for the federal government or for Nelson Mandela in South Africa when they were changing the regime down there. Important information about how we solve problems and work together. This particular slide here that I'm showing you, it's not any great mystery about how we plan things, at least not in a democracy. But this is the basic format of what we show in the book, and that is any system, any systematic way, and in this case, we'll talk about urban forestry still, starts off with people and their values and creating a vision of what the future desired condition needs to be, okay? And from that, again, it'll be people working on this, not necessarily the bureaucracy or the experts like us, this is not our place yet, to say what the goals will be. So what do you want the future to look like? What would the goals be? And then remembering that the role of government is constrained. Remembering that the role of government isn't that they can do everything instantly, anytime we want them to. In fact, we all argue about that constantly in the United States, and rightly so. What is the role of government? But there are constraints. They can't do everything, okay? And finally, having objectives, smart objectives, the types of objectives that are linked to timelines that can be measured if possible. Some objectives it's hard to for urban forestry, but many can be measured, okay? and assigned to a particular group of people, whether it's a nonprofit or whether it's a government agency. Okay. Performance indicators, now we're getting down into the science and technology. This is where you and I play the biggest part, right? The other parts, the vision, the goals, the role of government and objectives, that was primarily the why. And that's based upon social values. Now we're down in, well, how do we do this? How do we implement the vision, the values of the people and sketch them out on the landscape? That's our job. That's where we come in. Not to tell people what they want, not to tell people what they want, but within an ethical framework to make it happen. So performance indicators, those are just steps along the way to achieving an objective, which you can measure progress. That's all. Very simple, right? Are we headed in the right direction? Are we incrementally moving towards the objective? Actions, obviously, are what gets translated down into departmental planning and down into annual planning and work planning, right? Work plans for individuals. All based upon that vision of the future desired condition and the goals. And then finally, monitoring the work that's being done. Is it being done on time? Is it being done by the people we say it's going to be done? Is it within budget? Monitoring, right? Something you don't really hear too much about in local governments or even federal governments. Long-term monitoring has to be done. We do it all the time. We do it with our budgets, with our families. If you have a business, you know you've got to do it because that's the only way you can keep your business going. But it has to become a common integrated part of any plan for the management of the urban forest within a city. But the city is not the only place that urban forestry is important. And that's why you and I have begun to recognize and will recognize more and more over the next 10 or 20 years, particularly in Peninsula Florida, that our role is much bigger than simply the defined, inside the boundary of the defined city, okay? Because our cities are growing and they're expanding and moving out. And even if they're not moving out as the legal definition of the city, they're certainly spreading out into suburbs and creating spin-off towns and spin-off cities until we have these big metropolitan regions. You know, in the late 50s and early 60s, which I can still remember, when I was in school, we were taught how about 25% of the people in the United States lived in cities, about 75% of the people lived outside the city, mostly on farms. Mostly on farms at that point. There wasn't so they wouldn't have the big interstate systems, right? So it wasn't a lot of suburbs. Today we have 85% of the people living in cities, and that percentage is growing all the time. So what we're doing becomes even more important. Again, it's a social system, right? So even more important and more critical, and I think that's good for what we think is important, because I think we're going to find that people want what we're trying to express to them is important, and that is the forest, the woodlands, the trees, the parks, right? But we can see that from this beautiful example of the work done by the 1,000 Friends of Florida, that in the next 50 years, we are expecting Peninsula Florida to be virtually a big metropolitan region. And what does that mean to us? And what does that mean to strategic planning for urban forestry? Well, one of the things we all know is that if you do it right in the first place, over the long haul, it costs less to maintain something than trying to go back in and trying to correct something that was done improperly. Now, that could be as simple as somebody planted the tree wrong, right? put it at the wrong depth, had circling roots, never pruned it. Now all of a sudden you're going out there 25 years later and they want you to make it look beautiful, and it's costs a lot of money. We all know Ed Gilman did such a magnificent job of teaching us all about pruning that we know that there is a system to pruning. And the way that you do it is you prune the roots and you put the tree in properly, and then you prune it, over time, that first 15 years. And by God, it's a much more cost-effective way of doing things. The same holds true with bigger landscapes in the urban forest. If, as these urban areas move out into the countryside, if we can work through an integrated strategic plan with other departments, including like the Florida Department of Transportation and the engineers who work within municipal county governments, to allow for the incorporation of forests, woodlands, and trees. Then we now have the space for them, and we know that once we have the space for them, that the vast majority of problems that we can avoid, all those conflicts. And with that, the engineers, the arborists, the foresters, the planners can actually begin to get away from all the tension that arises from all those conflicts to a cooperative, collaborative type of approach to urban forestry. But we have to get involved in this part of urban forestry too. And of course, you can see by the image below, it's not just happening here in Florida. That image below shows the mega regions that are beginning to develop all through the United States. The other part, of course, is that at this point, if we don't get involved, we are going to lose the native forest of Florida. And that native Florida forest, while we don't talk about it a lot within the urban context, within municipal governments, let's face it, that's creating a lot of the ecological services that we talk a great deal about with urban residents and urban governments. Okay, it's the green swamps, right? It's the Ocala forests that are doing tremendous amounts of work in terms of sequestering carbon and allowing for rivers to have clean water and regulated flows as they move through cities, and allow for the great diversity of life, including many of the things that our residents love to see, like birds. Important. We can't lose these things. If we lose these forests, if we lose these grasslands, then we degrade the city also. So urban forestry has to move out of the urban province itself, out into the countryside, and begin to interact, particularly, I think, in this case, with county governments, because it's in county governments where we control most of the land use laws and the potential for urban growth and the development of metropolitan regions. So what my colleagues and I are leaving for you, if you will, in this book, is a way to proceed, a way to tap into the social values that we have already demonstrated support urban forestry and the conservation of forests and grasslands and rivers and streams and wetlands, to use those values to teach the political body which leads the agencies, and set it up in a way that the governments begin to actually integrate urban forestry and the care of the natural environment into the engineered types of work that they do to protect the health and welfare of people. This is just a schematic that I'm showing you. I'm not going to try and show you all the steps. There are 28 steps to this. This is not easy. I know that what I'm talking about is very different for most of you to think about, but you can do it. You can do it. I went to the same schools and did the same thing you did, right? I mean, you know, I was a forester. Used to go out and meet the landowner or the farmer in the morning and help them manage the wood lot, and maybe help them sell trees, and you know, timber buyers would come by. I did those things, right? But you have that basic knowledge that's so important to make the whole strategic planning of the urban forest happen. Without you, what is left is not insignificant, but it is an engineered approach to the landscape. And with so many people moving into the city, we cannot afford to have the entire peninsula of Florida become an engineered environment. So, of course, the important part of what we need to recognize also is that, you know, we as urban foresters, municipal arborists, foresters, wildlife biologists even, you know, have to find a way to develop strategic planning that is integrated into governments, supported by the political process, and that just doesn't disrupt everything that everyone's doing. That's what this little diagram is showing. We're suggesting that a strategic plan for urban forestry for any nonprofit, city, you know, county government should just start off by thinking in a longer term, 20 years. I mean, trees, how long do they grow? I mean, we know that if it's in the right space, at the right place, it's nothing for a tree to live for 100 years, for 300 years, for even longer. So why should we be writing plans that are 2 and 3 years in length? You know, why do we design plans for plantings in parks in which we just plant them and maintain them for 2 or 3 years and let it go? We know that that doesn't work. We know that that's not cost effective. We also know that they fail lots of times. And when they fail and the people see that they fail, that we're teaching people that this is really hard to do and that you can't be successful. So this thing here, we say, hey, let's work with the government to have a 20-year plan, and every 5 years, spin off an operational plan that matches the cycle of creating a budget and developing operational plans within the government itself. In other words, 5-year planning cycles for agencies. The last thing I want to say to you today relative to this strategic planning thing, and this comes, by the way, from Kathy Beck, who really encouraged me to begin to talk about ethics. I'm not saying that anybody's not ethical. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is be bold, be honest. Our profession, there are very few of us relative to the population, very few of us relative to the number of people who work within municipal governments. When you're asked a question or when you're part of a conversation, don't be shy. If something's not right, say it's not right. That's why they pay us. They don't pay us to just do and not have an opinion. That's what our education is all about, is to have an opinion, so long as it's founded and it has a logical and defensible premise. It has been my pleasure to be with you this morning. It has been my sincere pleasure to work with you over these last 18 years. I've learned just a tremendous amount from you, and most of what I just said this morning actually comes from what I learned from being here and working with you. So I hope you all have a good conference. And that's it for me. And I'm going to say goodbye at this point. Take care.